Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So everyone, welcome back to another edition of the Fatigue Files podcast. And I have with me today Carissa Conrad, who's a doctor of physical therapy and a therapeutic pain specialist. And I rather suspect we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the vagus nerve.
Yes.
But Carissa, before we get into any of that, why don't you tell me a bit about you and how you got into the work you're involved with? And I believe you recovered yourself from chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID or similar complex fatigue conditions. So can you just briefly fill us in, the listeners in on your story, really?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. I've been excited about having this conversation. So my story with long COVID began when I developed COVID Memorial Day weekend. So here, that's last weekend of May in 2022. And I had a pretty typical infection for, somebody of my age group. But before I had gotten COVID, I was already pretty run down. I had very small children. My son was about 16 months old. I was already showing some signs that my nervous system was struggling with the level of stress that I was putting my body under. I was nursing and not sleeping. And so COVID was pretty typical, like I said, but as I recovered from the initial infection, I, started adding a little bit of exercise back into my life. And I noticed that my legs felt heavy. And started reaching out to other friends I knew that had COVID and saying, hey, does this sound like anything you experienced? And of course, that was not the case for them. And over the course of that summer, essentially, I just worsened to the point where I had to go stay with my parents. I was mostly couch bound. I had to have some help, a lot of help with my small kids. At that point, they were 7 and 18 months. And I just worsened over the course of 6 months. Really couldn't leave my home. If I did, I would have the awful post-exertional malaise and really severe anxiety, extreme fatigue, and just really struggling to find answers. I went to lots of different doctors. I remember going to urgent care and telling my mom sitting outside of urgent care, those people that just collapse out of exhaustion and like end up in the hospital. I'm like, that's what I feel like right now, like that I'm just going to crumble to the ground and not get back up again. Very scary time. And so by the end of the year of 2022, that was I got to my worst, where I was, a lot of the time in a room, dark, closed door, couldn't handle anything. It seemed everything set my system off. My kids crying or, just needing something. It just felt like an overwhelming burden. And so I was lucky to find a good naturopath who got me started on low-dose naltrexone at the beginning of 2023. And that helped a little bit to start calming my nervous system down. But of course, being a mom, I ended up pushing really hard and crashing. And also around that time, I had started seeing a physician at the University of Washington long COVID clinic. Took me about 6 months to get an appointment there, but that was helpful as well to be in touch with somebody there who had seen many people recover. And so after my crash, she encouraged me to start taking a very low dose SSRI. And that the combination of the low dose naltrexone and a very low dose SSRI helped balance my nervous system to the point where I was starting to just come out of that really dark place and see the potential for some improvement. But ultimately, it was the vagus nerve stimulation that brought me all the way to the place I am today in my recovery.
Okay, so what did you use back then that helped you so much?
Yeah, so I started doing some research on vagus nerve stimulation because I'd heard somewhere in my listening to many recovery stories and podcasts, et cetera, little things here and there like, oh, vagus nerve stimulation. And I found that you could use a TENS unit. And as a physical therapist, I'm very familiar with the TENS unit, but I'd never been introduced to using it for vagus nerve stimulation before up to that point. So it took me some time to, do the research, figure out what kinds of parameters I would need to use and how I would need to use it. And I purchased a TENS 7000 machine, which is one that most physical therapists have laying around their clinics. That's a very commonly used device in that world. And I set it with the parameters that I had found. And I remember, and I had these very terrible, uncomfortable ear clips that I had come across. And I remember the first time hooking everything up, and it was like I was experiencing this calm sensation that I had not experienced in over a year at that point. And so that was when I knew I'd probably come onto something that was gonna help me.
Yeah, because I was very struck when you were describing your post-exertional malaise, you immediately paired it with anxiety, and you mentioned fear as well. So it seems that fear and anxiety were very much in the mix for you. And that's completely understandable. I remember when I was really ill. I mean, it is actually quite scary when your body completely stops doing what you expect it, the brain,
right,
me inside expects it to do. And if you're as you were in a dark room with a closed door, with any stimulation being completely overwhelming, there is a real sense, I think, in which you kind of feel like you're losing yourself. And, it can be very frightening. So I'm just intrigued about the relationship between fear, anxiety, and vagal stimulation on one side, and the relationship between, you can't really separate them because it's one complex system, but in terms of emphasis, if you were a perfect Zen master, perfectly calm, and you had symptoms, do you think, Carissa, that vagal stimulation would still deliver from symptoms, or that there's more to the story and that the nervous system overactivation of the anxiety, the fear, the tension is a core part of a more complex story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think what I have discovered as, kind of the key to recovering from these conditions is the consistent activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And what so many of us struggle with these conditions is, our nervous systems are completely dysregulated. So we lose track of even a sense of what state our nervous system is in. So regardless of whether you were a Zen master prior to becoming ill, it's as though you don't have control over the state of your nervous system anymore. I think that's a story I hear so commonly over and over again with the people that I work with. And that's certainly how I felt, where, this was a level of anxiety far and above, anything that I had ever experienced before, something that felt, like I couldn't bring it back down to a reasonable level. And so, regardless of what intervention or plan that you take for recovery, it's ultimately about the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so if I had been able to bring myself into a, completely Zen state on a regular basis, I would have recovered rather quickly. What I struggled so much with, and I think, again, I hear this time and again, and I think particularly for parents, bringing the nervous system into that parasympathetic state when you kind of have that constant activation with your kiddos around, if sound is a challenge for you and you have kids, it's just it feels like a constant, onslaught to your nervous system, a constant attack. And that's really what's going on, right? The brain is perceiving that sound as a threat to your survival. And so it's giving you an experience of symptoms in response to that. So for me, it was, I really required some kind of external assistance, to bring my nervous system into that parasympathetic state.
Yeah. And what would you say to people who actually are too deeply parasympathetic? How would you work with people who are in a chronic freeze, for example?
Chronic freeze, yeah. So I use the polyvagal chart a lot in my work. And I think that the polyvagal chart is very useful because it shows that kind of bell curve, right? And so the way that I walk people through that is, looking at this and saying, this is how an animal responds, any animal, whether human or otherwise, right? And so if you look at, or you take the example of like a gazelle in Africa, right? And it sees the lion coming at it. First of all, before it sees the lion, it's in that ventral vagal, which is that healthy parasympathetic state, right? It's grazing. It sees the lion, it's going to go into fight or flight. It's going to run away. When it knows that it's hopeless, right? When it knows that it's been caught, it goes into that freeze state, right? And the freeze state is essentially preparation for death, right? It's this this hopeless state of just immobility. Now, if that gazelle were to get away for whatever reason, it would go back through a fight or flight state as it runs away from the lion. And then once it knows it's safe, it goes back into that ventral vagal. And animals have this process that they go through of shaking off that trauma, if you will, or shaking off that nervous system experience. And humans don't really, we don't have anything. I think we did at one point. I think we had, I talk to people about this sometimes, kind of the rituals that used to exist in like tribal communities and things where, you'd be out during the day. The men, for example, might be out hunting and they would be in a sympathetic state. And then they come back and there's this process of ritual to re-engage with the family and the tribal unit. And that doesn't really exist for us anymore. But for those of us who have these nervous system dysregulation conditions, we are pushed into those states within the nervous system more readily, right? It's much more easy for us to be pushed into a sympathetic state or into a freeze state. So the goal is to come out of freeze. And sometimes people have to go through kind of this sympathetic experience before they get back into that healthy ventral vagal parasympathetic. That didn't necessarily occur for me, but I have worked with people that's been their experience. But so kind of looking at it like it's like an unhealthy parasympathetic, right? It's that freeze state, and we need to shift out of freeze, sometimes back through sympathetic, and then into that healthy ventral vagal. So it's about awareness of the nervous system state and using a variety of tools, including vagus nerve stimulation, to come back out of that state and into the healthy ventral vagal.
And how much time do you spend? I mean, I, like you, work with clients. And one of the things I often have to talk to clients about is that actually sometimes we need sympathetic arousal. And it's not something to be scared of. There's a kind of, we can get into a mythology that's a bit analogous to some spirituality practices where, the aim is like quiescent kind of tranquility all the time. And of course, that's not really how we're designed to operate. Mm-hmm. So when you say healthy parasympathetic, how much are you building into that? Just the idea of nervous system responsiveness, like appropriate levels of nervous system intelligence and responsiveness, rather than what I hear in recovery groups, which seems to be people always trying to feel safe, always trying to feel calm, which as a hypnotist, I know can actually build a counterproductive dynamic where in fact you're kind of scared of being scared, and that becomes counterproductive, right? So in your frame, when you work with clients, Carissa, do you tease that nuance out with them? And if so, like, how do you do it? How do you help people feel deeply safe with their own nervous system responses in different contextual, situations where some contexts demand and need a strong sympathetic response? And that shouldn't be something that we fear or resist necessarily, but there has to be like this appropriate flexibility and balance in the system, a highly responsive system. So how do you work with that?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I think one way that I look at it is our parasympathetic nervous system should actually be dominant, right? Like we should mostly be functioning in a more parasympathetic state with, yes, pushes into sympathetic as necessary, right? That's how we're designed in order to, in those circumstances where we need to survive. However, our brains have evolved to be kind of constant threat detectors, right? Like that's, so we tend to, most of the people, even who are not ill with these conditions, most people kind of live in a sympathetic overdrive much of the time. We get stressed and we just stay up there all day long. And so it's really about, I think a key piece is that education of being in touch with your nervous system state, understanding that if you are stressed, that the body is meant to experience that stress, but then just like in that example of the gazelle, it's meant to come back out of that state and back into ventral vagal, back into connectivity with those around you, et cetera, right? We need that, that nervous system regulation and co-regulation with others around us. And most of us just, we kind of just function in the sympathetic overdrive state. So I think it's a lot about recognizing like, oh, that was a stressful situation. I even do that sometimes, like something, my kid does something crazy, and you go, and then you watch yourself come back out of that state. And I think that sitting back and watching, and understanding that this is what our bodies are designed to do. And then to come back into that safe space. So if my kid climbs up on this is very much my child, climbs up on, the counter and is going to jump off, again, very common scenario, you have that moment of kind of a sympathetic, like, I need to make sure he's safe. But then when he is safe, coming in and gathering him in and connecting, and, we're back in ventral vagal, we're connecting. So I think a huge part of the key is education and awareness, because like I said, so many of us were not probably aware of our nervous system state even before we got ill. Most of us were very driven, high performing individuals, right? So we lived in that, we used adrenaline to push ourselves, but knowing that is ultimately unhealthy and leads to illness. I mean, that's really what's at the core of so much illness, is that overuse of that sympathetic state.
Yeah, I mean, I think I absolutely agree that, we're designed to have acute stress response and then down regulate it. Again, it's about flexibility, right? It's about that ability to be flexible. If a tiger bursts into this room now, I do not want to be too chilled out. I want everything online so I can escape, right? But afterwards, like you say, shaking it off. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that one of the problems we face, one of the reasons why so many people are kind of hyper aroused a lot of the time at a chronic level. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it only affects at all those of us who've had chronic fatigue. I just think we were the people who, maybe you're right, maybe some of us were driven personalities, but actually, if you look at culture more broadly, we see a culture that is at odds with parasympathetic rest and digest states a lot of the day. And it comes from the internalization of the speed of capitalism and the pressure from employers to produce. Mm-hmm. The mind-body split where we decide what needs to get done, and the body's just this wet machine that gets us to our head-dominated aims. There's all that in play, right?
Absolutely.
But there's also, for my money at least, a sense of disjointedness between the way the body evolved, including what we're talking about here with the way that the nervous system evolved to function as part of a complex body system, right? It's a lively, intelligent assemblage, and there's lots of communication that goes on in the body that doesn't go through the nervous system. I mean, we're amazing, right? But the nervous system is a very powerful tipping point in this larger system. But I know, for example, that if I align my life with circadian light movements, that settles my nervous system, right? My nervous system evolved from cells that grew up in the light. The same with nutrients. If I get adequate nutrients early enough in the day, I'm basically saying to my body, it's okay, it's safe, you're supplied. My nervous system is less likely to be jarred into action. So I love the idea of bringing the nervous system story that we hear in recovery groups into this wider sense of what we are as material beings being pressed by systems. And I noticed you said there about co-regulation. And I think what we're seeing a lot of is a co-dysregulation.
Yes.
right? We're seeing, and not just from other people who are pushed and who maybe push us when we're ill. You know, that classic thing, Carissa, of people feeling completely misunderstood by people who are driving. And why can't you just get up? Why can't you exercise mind over matter? Why can't you just decide? Well, because it's more complex and I'm dealing with an intelligent body system that's communicating. But that whole thing of dysregulation from environmental factors as well. I mean, I think it's Dr. Chestnut was pointing out that if there were any other species that you looked at that was suffering the kind of mass fatigues that we're seeing in all sorts of ways in our culture, you wouldn't look at the individual and say, what's wrong with that individual? You might do that, but you would look at the environmental factors and you say, what the hell is going on?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, Carissa, as a doctor committed to this work, and you do great work and you see great results, how do you help patients reframe and rebuild their relationship with broader cultural and social drivers?
It's excellent. I find this very fascinating, this whole concept. So first of all, there's this process, as you're working with somebody in recovery where, there's a bit of a survival period, right? Where it's like, we just need to get you regulated. Like that's step one. Like, let's get you to the point where you are doing well with the vagus nerve stimulation, where it is regulating your nervous system, and you're starting to see that you are tolerating your current activity level better. And then let's make a plan for building your activity level, right? And pairing that stimulation with a paced activity plan. And then, as it comes out of that kind of survival mode again, you're like, okay, I'm starting to re-engage with life more. I'm starting to, get back to who I am. Then, we can look at some of these bigger, broader issues like that. And I find this, this co-regulation aspect and, and again, back to kind of this looking at what was in place when we were a tribal society, versus what we have now. Just looking at the family structure, so again, this in a heterosexual relationship, for example, if you have a traditional, let's say traditional setup where a man is out working or, or in the case I explained earlier, hunting, for example, and the woman is at home. In the past, we had this setup where, first of all, the men did that together, and the experience was kind of a sympathetic state, right? As you are out hunting, and there's a lot of that spike into sympathetic and back down into parasympathetic. But then when the woman is at home, you have those experiences also. If you have children, you are going into sympathetic as you're caring for your children, then you're coming back down. But you have this assistance from extended family members in that, in caring for your children. So you had opportunities throughout the day to shift down into a parasympathetic state. Then when everybody comes together in the evening, you had rituals, as a tribe, and then rituals within your family unit to bring you back into that parasympathetic state. And so then you had the opportunity to co-regulate because you are both regulated individually. And I think, the way that our society is set up now is we don't come back down into that parasympathetic. You come home from work, both people have worked very hard, have been in a sympathetic overdrive state much of the day, regardless of what that work is, whether it's outside of the home or inside of the home. And so it creates more of a conflict state rather than a co-regulation state in a lot of situations, and that extends out into the greater society, right, and into relationships with others. And so there is an element of this of kind of sitting back and questioning how you want to structure your life and how can we structure life in a way that supports our own nervous system regulation and our ability to co-regulate with others. Certainly as a mother, this is something that's constantly on my mind because my goal is to provide, a safe emotional environment for my children. And if I'm dysregulated, I'm not responding to their needs in a way that's supporting their nervous system development to be safe. So it's a both and where I am again, back to that whole recognition of my nervous system state, recognizing when I need to regulate myself so that I'm available for others. And then in a broader context, it's, how do I make my work day, my work day and my availability to others be conducive to being supportive within my family. And so I think it's, and not everybody has that flexibility. Not people have the demands of their jobs, and that's the unfortunate reality of of life being the way it is in the United States and around the world. So, but it's trying to find, where can I make this time to regulate? Can I build, can I build a structure within my family where we reconnect in the evening, or how can we support within our family structure? And it's really saying, well, our family is going to be different. We're going to look a little different than maybe all these other families. Something even just like how many sporting activities can my kids, possibly tolerate, and how many can I tolerate driving them to and from? And, maybe they're not in 5 clubs and 3 different sports at once, and maybe each of them have to choose one, or, and that's just the health of, my health, my kids' health, and my family's health. And so those types of things, are things that I work with people on coaching, how can we structure your family situation to be more supportive of everybody's needs? And how does that look? And how does that, help you in your recovery? And when you realize that you don't have to keep up with what you thought you had to keep up with in terms of what, society tells you, it's very freeing.
I agree. And I think we're talking as well here from a relatively privileged position, because as you rightly allude to very briefly, I think if I heard you right, some people don't have these choices, actually, that, there are single parents working 3 jobs and barely getting through the day and falling into bed. And they don't necessarily, because of the way we've atomized our culture, as you say, there isn't always the support network there. And, you sort of think it's not rocket science. If someone is managing kids on their own and holding down 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, and even then it's not enough, that's constant stress. So I think it drives to sort of deeper questions about how we want to collectivize our lives. But for those of us that do have the capacity to change our family dynamic and the regularity with which we do things and everything, I think I would absolutely agree with you that it's really important to resist speed, apart from when it's absolutely necessary, and to have kind of an ethic of slowness, of presence, of grounding, of taking your time. And of course, there's more here in the sense of it does invite as well a practice of sort of, yes, nervous system awareness, but not nervous system focus, a kind of expansiveness around our own somatic being, our own physiology, whereby we can be aware of what's happening and we can even feel and experience the discomfort of arousal, but we stay really grounded in some part of ourselves that is expansive and spacious enough to allow that. And I'd love to explore with you a little bit the difference between kind of using a TENS machine, and I'd love to talk about that a bit with you because I know that you use those very effectively, and the point at which it really becomes important to leave the machine behind and have the moment by moment capacity to choose, in this moment, how do I respond? In this moment where I feel activated, how do I respond? One of the things I work with a lot is self-directed neuroplasticity, very fast, rapid state shift techniques that enable people to go parasympathetic very, very fast, but without a machine. But the machine, I think, for some people, as you say, if they've never contacted their nervous system in any way with any self-awareness, can be a phenomenal breakthrough training tool. And also sometimes it's really necessary. In my own case, I had 32 years of relationship with MECFS, and I was a very experienced meditator. I could state shift. I knew all about the brain stuff. I was doing all that stuff, but I had a thread in my primitive streak, I kind of think of it being there, of like an underlying tension that never quite went. And I was born in a war zone, and it's not difficult to see why that might be the case and why it might be very early, why it might have been very early in my system. And in the end, Carissa, the only thing that really settled it was a machine. It was actually, in my case, the Apollo Neuro, which was the only thing. And I wore it for 6 months. I absolutely didn't notice any difference for ages, but I didn't care because I read the science and I believed the research. And I thought, right, I'm going to do this. It's not linear. It's not a case of do this, you'll get that. It's a complex thing. And I stuck with it, and it absolutely dealt with it. Whereas everything else I'd done, and I hadn't learned self-hypnosis and self-directed neuroplasticity techniques that I teach back then. I do believe they're extremely powerful. So I'd love to talk about this relationship between the wisdom of the machine use and the wisdom of leaving the machine behind, or the wisdom of coming to the machine periodically, because it seems there's a balance between choice in the moment and habituation to a base state. I'd love you to speak to that.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, first of all, back to this idea of, kind of that kind of survival period of recovery, right? Where, like, certainly for me, and for many of the people I work with, the vagus nerve stimulation is like this necessary tool to get through these beginning stages where it helps to regulate, the nervous system while we are having such difficulty regulating it ourselves, because of that kind of heightened experience that we have when we're so dysregulated with these ME/CFS long COVID conditions. And then after we kind of gone through that, I still use my vagus nerve stimulation regularly. For me, it's something that I use to assist in my process of shifting my brain pathways. Vagus nerve stimulation enhances neuroplasticity. So I will often use it as an opportunity to gain some distance from whatever experience I'm having that's challenging me, for example. So if I am looking at a situation that I would like to change my perspective on, and I often use the example of my beautiful children, whom I love so much. I love them very, very much, but they definitely challenge me. Of course, children challenge us. And, so what I find so fascinating, excuse me, is just looking at things from the perspective of, why does this make me go into a state of fight or flight, right? So if my children are fighting, or just getting an email from, somebody that, like a boss, or, and it throws somebody off, what is it about that brings you into a fight or flight state? And so the way that I have done this, and the way I coach others, is to just pause and look at that and say, isn't that interesting that my brain thinks this is a threat to my survival? Because that's what the brain is doing. There's no difference in the experience within the brain or the nervous system, whether you're being attacked by that lion or you got that email that's stressing you out. It's the same process that's occurring in the body, and the brain is perceiving that as a threat to your survival. And so gaining that perspective has helped me grow immensely in my own, personal growth. And I have used vagus nerve stimulation as that tool to assist me. And I would say I have grown leaps and bounds in the last, just 6 months in terms of my own personal growth. And that's much, much more than I ever was able to, before I came across vagus nerve stimulation. And I think that a large part of that is because the stimulation does bring my nervous system into that state of safety. And then I'm able to look at the circumstance from a different perspective. And then that allows me to start shifting my experience of that trigger, whatever it may be.
So what I'm hearing there, and you must correct me if I'm mishearing you, is that the first shift has to be somatic. It has to be in the body, because it's the body that's changing the perspective. In other words, the storying or the analysis, right, shifts, the perspective shifts after the body shift. So what I'm hearing you say there is that by getting your body physiologically into this more expansive state of parasympathetic, it opens up other neural possibilities or other ways of interpreting or lensing what else is going around, right? And I think that's I think that, to me, the body's always the most decisive point, because brain and body are one thing anyway. They're like one system. It's not as if the brain isn't part of the body. It is. It's just a particularly powerful, interesting, creative, amazing part of the body. But we know that there are many more afferent nerves than there are efferent nerves. We know that the body is sending many more, the rest of the body, I should say, to be accurate, is sending many more signals up to the brain than the brain is sending to the rest of the body. So I actually really love that point about the TENS machine and how it helps you somatically shift, and then the other stuff, the interpretive stuff, can follow more easily there. At what point, Carissa, I mean, if I put you on a desert island without a TENS machine, right, but in an environment where you've got some natural challenges and stresses, do you feel that where you've got to now, you would be able to regulate very quickly into a parasympathetic state without the machine? Is that where you've got to now?
Yes, I can. And that's another point, is that vagus nerve stimulation tones your vagus nerve. So over time, that shift is more readily available to you. And I would absolutely say that is true based on my personal experience and professional experience. I can much more easily pause even without the use of the stimulation and bring myself back down into parasympathetic if I am triggered into a sympathetic response. And so, and certainly, I've built quite a toolbox of tools over the years for bringing myself into parasympathetic state without the vagus nerve stimulation. It's just such a wonderful tool to have, and I think especially again, as a parent, and really anybody who's super busy in this world of nonstop go, having the opportunity to bring yourself into parasympathetic. And as an additional, sometimes, if I've had a particularly stressful day, it's difficult to, meditate into a parasympathetic state, or it's difficult to drop down into that, meditative state. So sometimes I'll combine the stimulation with the meditation. But yes, I would say, my nervous system is in a much healthier and resourceful state now than it was before I discovered stimulation.
Yeah, and I definitely felt very strongly that the Apollo helped me with that. I mean, my view is use everything that works. Basically,
right?
Why not
use the tools available? Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely, all the tools, without building technological dependence or without building dependencies of any kind, because that's inherently disempowering. But from what you're saying, that's not what you're advocating. You're advocating intelligent use of convergent approaches that enable a person to have greater agency in relation to their own nervous system responses, greater self-understanding, and the capacity to understand when there's a trigger, what the trigger is, and possibly why it's triggering, which gets into really interesting psychological territory. But it's really exciting to think that in this day and age where we are now, we can selectively deploy machines and technologies that we know can support our physiological, mental, emotional functioning, and at the same time allow ourselves to use a wide range of non-technological techniques and tools that are endogenous, that are online capacities of the self. Because, we are extraordinary. Human beings are extraordinary. And if there's one thing I've noticed about people who get chronic fatigue and stuff like that, is if you've had it for years and years and years, rather than just 5 or 6 years, but like decades, it's very easy to forget the enormous capacity that you have online as a human being, because you've gradually been denuded of that sense of capacity, right? Which I guess would point logically towards the idea that the right vagus nerve stimulation technology could be a key to actually start to expand again very gently with minimal effort, which speaks to ease of healing, right? Which is a beautiful thing. So where would people find you, Carissa, if they're interested in working with you? How will they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website, carissaconraddpt.com, has many tools available. I have kits that I've put together for vagus nerve stimulation using TENS units. So the TENS units, I have a couple of different options. One is the TENS 7000, which is what I used throughout my recovery. And then I have just now introduced another option for people, which is the Twin Intensity 3, which is digital and allows for a slower increase in terms of intensity. So that's a great option for people who are more sensitive or are more ill, for the ability to go a little more slowly with progressing the intensity of the stimulation. And so both of those are available along with, and the kits come with the ear clips and all the pieces that you need. And the TENS units are already preset with the appropriate parameters for vagus nerve stimulation to optimize their use. And along with that comes a video series that goes through my protocol, because ultimately these devices are fantastic, but it's really the how you use it and how you employ the stimulation that makes the biggest difference. And so that's something that I have found to be so important, is that structure and intentional use of the stimulation as part of your activity progression. And also available on my website, and I have a YouTube channel as well. It's at the Vagus Nerve PT. There's a special breathwork meditation track that's designed to induce that state of calm and serenity. This is something that I used quite often when I was recovering. I loved paced breathing. I did that a lot as part of my nervous system regulation. So I collaborated with Reshaped, who is a professional musician and producer, and he's done work for the Monroe Institute and many other clients and organizations. And he's just done a really beautiful job of creating a breathwork track. So that's available as well. And I'm happy to put anybody in contact with him if he can help. So yeah, lots of things for nervous system regulation, lots of tools, and I'm available for individual coaching. And I'm just building, more resources daily. I want to reach and help as many people as I can. I know how difficult this illness is and how scary it can be. And so, I always told myself when I got to the other side of this, that this was going to be my life's work, is reaching as many people as I could to let them know that recovery is absolutely within their reach. So please do reach out.
Beautiful. Just before we go, is there a kind of top tip or two that you'd like to share with the listeners about how to use a TENS machine, like about the relationship with intensity, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first of all, of course, there are vagus nerve stimulation devices available, and TENS units are widely available. It is very important to have the optimal parameters for vagus nerve stimulation on the TENS unit. This is something, you don't want to just experiment with it. You want to know for sure appropriate parameters, and which is why I've put together the kits that I have, so that there's no question about that. And as far as intensity goes, I was able to jump right in with a sensory level of intensity with my TENS unit for the vagus nerve stimulation. I think that part of the reason that was doable for me was because I had some support from some medications that were nourishing my nervous system. And so if you tend to be more sensitive or are more ill, it is important to go slowly. And I think working with someone like myself who can guide you through that process is really, really key. I have progressed many people from 30 seconds, with a TENS 7000 up to, the point where they're getting that nervous system regulation from it, and it takes some time, but having that guidance is really, really useful and important, I think.
Okay. And one final question. Can you overtone the vagus nerve?
This is an interesting question. I do not think, people will ask me, is there a top limit, to how much vagus nerve stimulation you can do? So first of all, there are surgically implanted devices that are continuously giving an impulse directly into the vagus nerve. And so, this is a medical, it's a thing. And we're doing this transcutaneously. So it's not, we're going through the skin. We're not directly on the nerve. So I've never come across anything that has, suggested that overtoning is a possibility. But again, I think having the guidance from somebody experienced with this is important. I usually, kind of set a top limit in terms of hours per day, because the other thing that we don't want, particularly when we're using transcutaneous nerve stimulation, we don't want the nerve to become sensitized to that input either. That's another piece. We want the nerve to feel the shift when we apply the stimulation. So there is a balance there, I think, as always. But I think it's unlikely, that for it to become overdone. But overstimulation is a possibility, and that's where we need to be in touch with our nervous system state and know what the appropriate amount of stimulation is for each individual.
Yeah. Thank you, Carissa. It's been really lovely to speak with you, and I'm really grateful to you for coming on and sharing your experience and insights with the listeners.
Thank you so much.